Bill is going to take up the slack. Thank you.
Okay. I don't know if any of y'all would get this stainless banner, but this lady right here, she sends that out all the time. This is Cassy Gray. She is a Civil War historian with special interest in the Army of Northern Virginia. She's traveled throughout the country giving programs on General Lee, Jackson, Stewart at Gettysburg, and Forrest at Fort Pillow, and Braxton Bragg. She has spoken at the Words Memorial Service in Andersonville, Georgia, Confederate Day at Stone Mountain, Georgia, was the keynote speaker at 2012 Military Order of the Stars and Bars National Convention in San Antonio, Texas. She is the editor and publisher of the Stainless Banner. She is a small press that is dedicated to the preservation of Southern heritage and history. Miss Cassy Gray.
Well, good evening. It's so good to be in a place where Confederate flags fly. And when I say Stonewall Jackson, people don't look at me like, what position does he play on the Bengals? I'm actually from Cincinnati, Ohio. I do have to confess that my relatives, they marched for Sherman. But they were the Corporal Klinger of the Army of Tennessee, and they only had one goal, and that was to get out. They didn't wear dresses. But my brother got their file from the National Archives, and letter after letter after letter was written to try to get out of the Army. They were not up for it. In fact, they went in as privates and came out as privates. They had no ambition whatsoever. They just wanted out. So how does someone who's in Cincinnati, Ohio, not very interested in the war, except for the fact that I read Gone with the Wind 28 times. That is no exaggeration, I actually did. And how did I get interested in the war? The answer is quite simple. After 9/11, I went back to the University of Cincinnati to get a degree in international affairs. I wanted to go into counterterrorism. And I had an especially hard exam week. And so I was in the video store. Have you ever been in the video store and you want to watch videos but you don't really want to know what you want to watch? So I'm just walking back and forth up and down the aisles, and I see the movie Gettysburg. So I thought I would get that. And it was the last film that I watched that Sunday afternoon. And oh my word, when the men stepped out on that last day to charge Cemetery Ridge, I just started crying, and I'm not talking little tears. I'm talking about snot slinging, grab the cat, holding close, crying. I was moved, and in fact, I think I watched it 3 or 4 times before I had to return it. What gallantry, what honor, what bravery. Well, I knew there was a prequel called Gods and Generals, so the next weekend I got that. Worst film in the world. It was so long and so boring and so drab. But I recorded it. Don't tell the FBI. But I did record it. And the next weekend, while I was doing homework, I stuck it back into the VCR. And I was really interested in the character of Stonewall Jackson. I didn't know anything about him. So I have a thing that I do when I want to find out about someone. I go to the library and get every book you can find on him, which was James Robertson's big volume of Stonewall Jackson. And let me tell you something, he caught my attention. He grabbed it and he has held it ever since. He is a phenomenon. There is no one like him. He is the type of man that good men talk about. He's absolutely phenomenal. And what I wanted to do is I wanted to write about him, and I got an idea for a series of novels. It's a what-if, alternate history, what if Stonewall Jackson had survived Chancellorsville. So I had to do a lot of research, and what I learned about Jackson was simply this. He was not a one-dimensional thinker. When he put together a battle plan, he had contingency A, contingency B. What if B didn't work? Well, we'll do F. And if F doesn't work, we'll do G. And that's why he was so strict on his subordinate generals, A.P. Hill, Ewell, Early, because everything worked together. In the original records, you will find simply his invasion plan for the North. Jackson had one. He developed it while he was at Winchester in 1862. And what he simply wanted to do was this. He wanted to march to the Allegheny Arsenal, strip it of its supplies, then march east to Harrisburg. On the way, he was going to stop off in Cumberland and Washington counties in Pennsylvania and destroy the coal mills. He was going to stop the industrial machine. He realized that as long as the Federals could be totally defeated in another week and a half, ship another army, ship more cannon, ship more supplies down the rail lines, that they were never going to win. He believed that if he could stop the coal, then he could stop the blockade. And there's proof in that in the original records. They were always, the admirals of the boats, the captains of the boats, were always spreading. There's not enough coal. There's not enough coal. Harrisburg has its own significance. It was the great turntable of the North. Trains coming in from Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Ohio would have to go through Harrisburg, where they were switched to another train track with different gauge for the wheels. You take Harrisburg, you stop all of that coming west. So that was his plan, and that's what we developed. That's what I developed in the book. There's no we. I don't have anyone in my pocket. There's no we. So I have that in the book. Longstreet goes west, so I could meet Forrest, who I absolutely love, Nathan Bedford Forrest, so much that I named my cat after Nathan Bedford Forrest. I also have Jeb Stuart, and they're perfect. Forrest is a girl, but she thinks fighting solves everything. No matter what, she's ready to fight. Jeb Stuart, he doesn't like to fight, but if the battle is on, he will not back down. So that's what I have. And then I also have the stainless banner, volumes 1 and 2, Bryce's Crossroads in there. And then I have the new one out, volume 3, which has Fort Henry, Fort Donelson, Shiloh, Elkhorn Tavern, Parker's Crossroads, and those kind of battles. So they're for sale if you want them. Let's talk a little bit about Jackson. What I liked about Jackson is he was a unique individual. History has really warped his personality, I think. But he was shy, he was introverted, but once you got to know him, he was engaging, he was funny. One of my favorite stories is Jeb Stuart had come in. It was 1862, they're getting ready to go to Fredericksburg. Stuart comes in, Jackson's already in bed, all the headquarters is quiet, so Stuart just gets in the bed with Jackson. One camp bed, 2 people, 1 blanket. And Stuart fights him for the blanket all night and wins. The next morning, Stuart comes out of the tent. Good morning, General Jackson. Longstreet said Stuart could go to sleep faster than any man in the Army and wake up faster than any man in the Army. And when he woke up, he was always alert and cheerful. And he said, how are you doing this morning, General Jackson? And Jackson said, General Stuart, I'm always glad to see you. You could arrive at a more appropriate time, perhaps, but I'm always glad to see you. Then he bent over and rubbed his legs. But, General, you must not get into my bed with your boots and spurs on and ride me around like a cavalry horse all night. Another thing that he did to show his sense of humor was someone, he had an order, an outstanding order that pilfering from the civilians would get you court-martialed. Well, one soldier was pilfering because he knew that if he got caught, they would bring him to Jackson, and he really wanted to see Jackson. So he got caught, he gets brought up to headquarters, and Jackson asks Sandy Pendleton, what's the story? And Pendleton says, well, he just wants to see you. He says, well, get a barrel, put it right in front of my tent, and he can watch me all day if he wants to. Jackson came into my life when I had suffered a major disappointment. One of those disappointments it was hard to get over. And as I read about him, what really, really struck me and stayed with me all this time was his faith in God and his ever-kind providence and how he just turned his life over to God. And it didn't matter what tomorrow brought because tomorrow was already in the Father's hands and he accepted his fate. He lived a life where the circumstances, like I said, whether good or bad, did not affect that faith. During the war, you've probably heard this quote when he was asked, how could he be so brave in battle? He just simply replied, my religious beliefs teaches me to feel as safe in battle as in bed. God has fixed the time for my death. I do not concern myself with that, but to always be ready whenever it may overtake me. That is the way all men should live. Then all men would be equally brave. Those are words that don't even need to be spoken in war. They're good for today. He considered it, when he was wounded, he considered the blessing of God to die on a Sunday. Now today, in the politically correct society, he would be called a fanatic. But if he's a fanatic, then I'm a fanatic. Amen. Because I have a use for God in my life. And I always consider Jackson a challenge for my own faith. One of my favorite maxims of Jackson is never take counsel of your fears. So when I get afraid, I try to do the exact opposite, so I don't get captive. He overcame so much hardship in his life. He was 6 years old when the door knocked, and it was his Uncle Cummins. His mother was dying. And Jackson understood that he was going to be taken away from his mother. And he ran out the back door and hid in the woods until dark. And they finally convinced him to come in. And the next morning he said goodbye to his mother and left with his sister Laura to go and live in Jackson Mill in present-day West Virginia. 4 months later he was back. He said goodbye to his mother and she died. In fact, he doesn't even know where she was buried. He knew education was the key to bettering himself, and he wanted to go to West Point. But in that district, a lot of people wanted to go. A lot of students wanted to go to West Point, so they made him take a test, and he didn't pass the test. Gibson Butcher did and got the appointment. So Gibson Butcher goes up to West Point, doesn't like to be disciplined, didn't like the cold, didn't like the marching, turned around and left. But he didn't tell anybody he left. And one day Jackson was at Jackson's Mill, and he sees Gibson Butcher, and he says, why aren't you at West Point? He said, that's not the life for me. And Jackson immediately goes into action. And if you want to know anything about Jackson, watch him here. He goes through the town, and he gets letters from everyone of influence. Someone said to him, I can't give you that letter, Tom. I don't think you can make it in West Point. I don't think you have the education. Jackson answered, I am very ignorant, but I can make it up and study. I know I have the energy, and I think I have the intellect. He stuffs all his clothes into a saddlebag, rides a horse, catches the train, changes trains, goes to Washington, goes straight to his congressman's office, puts out the letters, and the congressman said, well, let's go see the Secretary of War. I don't know if today you could go see the Secretary of War so easily, but obviously you could back then. And he went, and he got recommended, and off he went to West Point. Now, he had to take an entrance exam. And he really didn't have the skills. And the administrators of the entrance exam, the proctors will say, they remembered him. He stood before the board trying to finish a math problem that it was above his head. He used his jacket as an eraser. He sweated, he strained, he thought, and when he was done, he was covered with sweat and chalk dust. But he had made it. He was in the bottom of the class. He was an immortal, but he was in West Point. At night, when everybody else went to bed, he would stuff the grates full of coal, lay his books in front of him, and begin to study way late into the night. West Point is a recitation where you stand up and recite what you learned yesterday to your instructor. And Jackson took many demerits because when they asked him to recite what he learned yesterday, he would say, I haven't learned last week's lesson yet. And until I learn that lesson, I can't move on. He would receive the demerit. He graduated 17th in his class. And his classmates said if he had one more year, he would have graduated first in the class. He moves to Lexington after serving not only in the Mexican War, but in the Seminole War. His job was to go out and find Seminole Indians, and he says you can't find Indians unless they want you to find them. So he would just march around a lake, come back and say, I don't know where they are. So he goes to Lexington, and he meets Eleanor Junkin. And he's telling his friend, he goes, I don't know what it is about her, but oh my word, she's so pretty. And when she speaks, it's like music. And they're like, Jackson, you're in love. He goes, I am. So he married her. And about between a year and 18 months later, he buried her and a young son. Eleanor died in childbirth. And it bent him to the ground and almost destroyed him. They were afraid for his health. They were afraid that he was going to commit suicide. He did not know what to do with that loss. They sent him overseas to Europe, and when he came back, he said, I am going to marry again. He knew exactly who he was going to marry. D.A. Hill, Daniel Harvey Hill's sister-in-law, Mary Anna Morrison. So down he goes to college. Down he goes to North Carolina. He marries her. They have a daughter named Mary Graham. Not much is known about Mary Graham, but 4 days after she was born, if you go to the general store receipts, it'll say that Jackson bought one child coffin. She died of a liver ailment. What we know about Jackson mostly comes from the war. He's all in. He gives it all. Whatever Virginia needs, whatever Robert E. Lee needs, he will find a way to do. He wanted to stay in the Union. He thought the South would do better in the Union fighting. But when Virginia seceded, he joined Virginia because that was his ideal of patriotism. He followed his state, as many of them did, as many of your ancestors did. They followed their state. I'm of the opinion that this all-in has been misinterpreted. One of the most frequent charges against Jackson was that he was secretive and didn't share his plans with his subordinates. Well, he had good cause. Most importantly, because soldiers talked. And remember on that big flank mark around Chancellorsville? Well, the tail end of the column got caught. And they were like, well, you're not going to be so cocky when Jackson gets on your flank. They gave away the plan. The good news was Hooker didn't believe it. Otherwise, they might have been waiting when he came charging out of the woods. The 11th Corps might have been waiting. To Jackson, it wasn't necessary that Hill, Early, Ewell, or Rhodes know what he was up to. He didn't need to know what Robert E. Lee was up to. He just needed to know his orders. You know, and he did that with Lee all the time. Lee would just give him general information. You need to find a way around the Union flank at Chancellorsville. All right. You need to take Harper's Ferry. Okay. You need to find a way into the rear of the enemy at 2nd Manassas. Consider it done. We'll march in 55 miles in 2 days. So we'll grab Manassas. We'll burn it. Whatever you need, I'll do it. When Jackson died, you know what? Lee wrote his wife, I scarcely know how to replace him. And Lee never did. And that was a great hole in the Army of Northern Virginia that never got filled. And that's not impugning the leadership of Ewell or A.P. Hill, but they were not Jackson. Lee needed Jackson's all-in attitude. He needed someone to be as brave and as cunning and as audacious as Robert E. Lee is. He found that in Jackson. After the war, when questioned about Gettysburg, Lee usually pointed to his 1864 official report as his response. He didn't really talk about it. He didn't like talking about the war. He would just say, look at my official reports. But he did say, if I had had Jackson with me at Gettysburg, I would not have lost. Jackson died as he lived. He was in front of his lines, trying to find a way to fulfill his orders, cut the Union retreat across the Rapidan, and kill every last Yankee. And when he died, he went gratefully into his father's arms. Now, you can't study about Jackson without this huge shadow falling over Jackson's story, and that shadow is Robert E. Lee. And now I came to know Lee through studying Jackson, so when I wanted to find out about Lee, you know what I did? Went and got a book. And I got Douglas Southall Freeman's volumes on Robert E. Lee. And it wasn't until I got to Appomattox did I realize I was reading a book about a great man. He did not want to surrender on April 9th, 1865. Everything inside of him did not want to surrender. But he did it because it was the right thing for his men. And that's the thing he always did. He always did the right thing. He practiced self-sacrifice for the good of others. I spoke at the Armistead Hill Good Camp in Virginia, and when you're in that part of Virginia, if you haven't been there, you constantly travel a road called Lee's Retreat. And one of the things Grant did after they broke the flank is he wanted to show the Army of Northern Virginia just how strong his army was. And so what he did is he had one night the cook fires lit. And I can imagine that place was so dark, and I was lost, kind of like tonight. I was lost, and I'm flying down these country roads going, please don't let there be any deer, please don't let there be any deer. And I could just imagine what it would be like to have all those hills filled with firelight. When he found out that Gordon, who was in charge of the Second Corps at the time, commanded the Second Corps, there was nothing more Gordon could do unless Longstreet came up, he knew it was over. And he said, then there is nothing left for me to do but go and see General Grant, and I would rather die 1,000 deaths. You know what he did? He ended the war. He didn't think it was his job to end the war. He thought that belonged to Jefferson Davis. But by surrendering, he ended the war because everybody else followed his lead. And when he was riding off to surrender, this is what I love about Robert E. Lee. When he was riding off to surrender, a soldier ran up to him and said, "Don't do it, General Lee, because history will hold you responsible for the loss of the South." And he said, if history holds me responsible, then history holds me responsible. I must do the right thing. You know what he did? He manned up. And in today's world where politicians keep blaming the past administration, it's kind of nice to see someone man up. And he took the responsibility of it. He said, it is our duty to live. What will become of the women and children of the South if we are not here to protect them? I would like to tell you one story about Lee before I close, and I love this story. Lee did not like pilfering either. He did not like when his soldiers went in and bothered civilians. And he had called General Hood to his headquarters, and he was talking to his adjutant, Lee was, Walter Taylor, and they were talking about pilfering. And Hood thought that conversation was for his benefit. So as soon as Walter Taylor left, Hood started a very vigorous defense of his Texas brigade. My men don't... General Lee held up his hand and he says, General Hood, when you Texans come about, chickens have to roost mighty high. I love that. You know, after the war, and he had time to reflect, and I think why he died was, one, a broken heart, and two, he kept so much inside of him, especially his Reconstruction really began to take hold. He did say this: we have failed, but in the good providence of God, apparent failure often proves a blessing. He left everything on the field. There was nothing more he could give. He did give it all. And finally, I wanted to tell you a story. I got a master's degree in Middle East history from Tel Aviv University, but there's not much you can do with a master's degree in Middle East history. I worked at my church's thrift store, and the students would come in, Miami University students would come in, and I'd say, what are you majoring in? And they would tell me, they said, what do you do? Look, you get a master's degree in Middle East history, you can work in a thrift store. So I went back and got a one-year certificate as a paralegal. And Professor Rubel was teaching on ethics. And he says, whenever you are in a quandary and you don't know what to do, just think this. And he points to the screen, he hits his PowerPoint presentation. What would Abraham Lincoln do? The whole room was quiet, and I went like this, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that loud. He glared at me. Lincoln was such a hero, and we had a little conversation. And I gave him a little thin book, 7 Effective Steps of Leadership. It's a little tiny book, and it talks about Lee's leadership, and I gave it to him. And you knew he didn't want to read it, but he didn't know what to do because I wasn't taking it back. I just held it out. The summer went by, and I got a call from Professor Rubel. He said, I read that book of yours. Actually, I thought he meant my novel. I was very excited, but didn't. He said, I didn't know that's who Robert E. Lee was. So this is what I've done. I've gone to the head of the business department at the University of Cincinnati, and I said, that book right there needs to be required reading for every business student that goes through our university. That says so much about these men that we admire, these men that we are fighting for in this politically correct environment. This environment that would turn our heroes into villains. We cannot let that happen. We must stand and we must fight. We must, doesn't matter what they say. It doesn't matter if they call us racist. It doesn't, we know the truth. Nathan Bedford Forrest did not massacre troops at Fort Pillow. It's not in him to do. Robert E. Lee was a good man, and Stonewall Jackson was a military genius, and it wasn't because the 5 Union generals he fought were incompetent. No, he was just that good. I want to thank you so much for letting me come and talk. I know there's a big storm coming, and I want to make sure you guys get out, but there's nothing like talking about Jackson and Lee. I can warm to my subject. I know you guys can, and I could talk for hours about Jeb Stuart, Nathan Bedford Forrest. Somebody frowned when I said Braxton Bragg. Oh, let me give you a defense on Braxton Bragg. I just love these men, and I thank you so much for letting me come and speak.